You reach for the exact same cardigan you always reach for, the one hanging closest to the door because you grab it so often without even thinking twice about it. It is the one you trust, the one that feels safe, the one you throw on whenever you want to feel a little more covered and a little more put together before you leave the house for the day. You pull it on, glance in the mirror, and something about it just does not look the way you honestly hoped it would. It is not that anything about it looks obviously wrong exactly, nothing you could easily point to directly if someone asked you. It just does not look balanced overall, and you genuinely cannot quite explain why, no matter how long you stand there studying your own reflection. Here is something genuinely worth knowing before we go any further together. That cardigan is not failing because of your body, and it truly never was, not for one single moment of it. It is very possibly failing simply because of its own length, landing at one specific point on your body that fights against your natural shape instead of genuinely working together with it. And almost nobody ever actually sits down and explains exactly what to look for when that happens to be the case. This video is specifically made for women over 60 who have a fuller midsection and reach for a cardigan constantly, the way most of us honestly do, and genuinely want it to help their outfit instead of quietly working against it every single time they put one on. We are going through 6 real, practical length-related details that actually determine whether a cardigan genuinely balances your body or throws it off entirely, covering exactly where it lands relative to your own hips, how the open front visually reads from the outside, how it actually behaves the moment you sit down somewhere, how its weight moves naturally with you throughout the day, whether a belt or tie genuinely helps or quietly hurts the overall picture, and finally, how every single one of those details connects specifically to your own individual torso. This is not a promise that any single length will hide your stomach completely, flatten anything about your shape, or make you look thinner than you actually and genuinely are. That would not be honest. And this particular video is genuinely not interested in promising you something it cannot actually deliver on, no matter how appealing that kind of promise might sound to you right now. And the very last detail, the one we are deliberately saving for the very end, ties every other length decision together in a way that finally makes real sense of why one single cardigan can look completely different on 2 women who both describe themselves using the exact same words. Stay with me all the way through these 6, because that final piece is genuinely the one that matters most out of everything we honestly cover today. Let's start right now, together, with the very first length decision, the one that begins in the exact moment the hem of your cardigan first lands somewhere specific on your hip, well before you have even added anything else to the outfit. Number 6, the hip point landing check. The first thing to genuinely check is exactly where the hem of the cardigan lands relative to your hips, because that single landing point can quietly work against the rest of your outfit no matter how nice the cardigan itself looks hanging on its own. Here is why this actually matters so much. A cardigan that stops right at the widest part of your hip creates a hard horizontal line exactly at the point where your body is already widest, drawing attention directly there instead of letting the eye move past it naturally. Land a little higher instead, and the cardigan can end at a genuinely narrower point of your torso. Land a little lower, and it can continue past your hip entirely, letting the eye travel downward in one continuous line rather than stopping abruptly there. None of these landing points is automatically correct for every woman watching this. What matters is understanding where your own cardigans actually stop, and whether that spot happens to be the widest point on your particular body. Here is a simple, practical way to check this for yourself. Stand in front of a mirror and look specifically at exactly where the hem falls relative to your hip, not your overall general impression of the outfit as a whole. Turn to the side and check again carefully, since a landing point that looks fine from the front can land quite differently once you actually see it from the side angle. Sit down and notice whether the hem rides up to a different point once you are fully seated, which can change this entire picture without you even realizing it happened. If you carry more fullness through your hips specifically, a hem that clears that widest point entirely, landing either well above it or well below it, often reads more balanced overall than one that stops directly on it. If your fullness sits more through your stomach than your hips, this particular landing point may matter a little less to you personally than the front opening details we are covering next in the following section. A shorter torso often means a mid-length cardigan reaches the hip faster than you might expect, so it is genuinely worth checking earlier rather than assuming you already know. A longer torso usually has more room to work with before reaching that same landing point on the body. This is only about where the hem lands relative to your own hips. Next, we look at what actually happens once that same cardigan is worn open, which is a completely different consideration. Number 5, the front edge vertical line effect. Now think about what happens when that same cardigan is actually worn open, because an open cardigan does something a closed one simply cannot. It creates two vertical edges running down the front of your body, and those two edges do far more visual work than most of us ever give them credit for. A cardigan worn closed presents your body as one solid, uninterrupted block of fabric from top to bottom. The same cardigan worn open instead frames the center of your body with two clean lines, drawing the eye up and down through the middle rather than across the widest point. This is not a claim that open cardigans automatically make every woman look thinner, because that would not be true. It is simply a different visual tool, one worth understanding on its own terms. Here is what actually determines whether this genuinely works in your favor. How far apart those two front edges sit when the cardigan hangs naturally matters enormously. Edges that sit close together create a narrow, focused vertical line. Edges that fall open wide can end up doing the opposite, framing a wider expanse of whatever is underneath instead of narrowing anything. Check this for yourself by letting the cardigan hang completely naturally without holding it closed or adjusting it in any way, and look closely at how far the two front edges actually land from each other. Notice whether they stay relatively close together on their own, or whether they genuinely want to swing open wide instead. Sit down and check again carefully, since gravity and your seated position can noticeably change how those edges fall compared to standing upright. If you carry more fullness through your stomach specifically, edges that sit closer together tend to create a more genuinely focused line exactly where you want the eye drawn most. If your fullness sits lower instead, through your hips, the width of those edges may matter a little less to you than where the hem itself lands, which we have already covered. What you happen to wear underneath also plays a genuinely real role here. A plain, simple layer underneath lets those two vertical edges do their job clearly and without distraction. A busy or heavily patterned layer underneath can compete directly with that line and cancel out the effect entirely, no matter how beautifully the cardigan itself happens to be cut or shaped. Understanding how the front actually hangs open is only genuinely useful once you also know how the whole cardigan behaves once you actually sit down while wearing it, which is exactly where we are headed next in careful detail. Number 4, the sitting behavior check. Here is something almost nobody actually checks before buying a brand new cardigan, and it genuinely turns out to matter enormously. What actually happens to the length once you sit down? A cardigan that lands exactly where you wanted while standing can behave completely differently the moment you take a seat somewhere, whether that is at a table, in a car, or simply relaxing on a couch. The fabric can bunch up around your hips and stomach, creating extra bulk exactly where you were hoping for a cleaner line. It can ride up shorter than intended, exposing more of your midsection than you planned for. Or it can pool oddly in your lap, adding visual width right across your widest seated point. None of this shows up if you only ever check a cardigan while standing in front of a mirror, which is unfortunately how most of us evaluate clothing before we buy it. Standing tells you almost nothing about how you will actually experience that cardigan through most of your actual day, since so much of daily life happens seated rather than standing perfectly still. Here is a simple way to check this properly. Try the cardigan on, and instead of only looking in the mirror while standing, sit down in a chair similar to ones you would normally use and stay seated for at least a minute or two. Look at how the fabric falls now. Notice whether it bunches, rides up, or pools differently than it did while you were standing. Lean forward slightly the way you might reaching for something on a table, and watch what happens to the length and shape during that movement as well. If you carry more fullness through your stomach, a cardigan with slightly more ease built into the body, rather than a snug fit, often behaves better once you are seated, since it has room to settle rather than being forced to stretch and bunch. If your fullness sits more through your hips, pay particular attention to how the fabric behaves right around that seated hip line specifically, since that is often where bunching becomes the most visible. Fabric that genuinely has some natural drape to it tends to fall more predictably once seated than fabric that is very stiff or very clingy, both of which can behave quite unpredictably once you sit down and the fabric is forced to move along with you. Knowing how a cardigan actually sits is genuinely useful information on its own, but it still will not tell you how the fabric itself moves and behaves with you throughout an entire real day, which is exactly what we are covering next in the following section. Number 3, the fabric weight and movement check. Beyond simply how a cardigan sits while seated, there is the separate and equally important question of how its fabric weight moves with your body as you go through an ordinary day, walking, reaching, turning, and simply living your life rather than standing still for a photograph. A heavy, thick knit holds a lot of structure, which can genuinely help a cardigan keep its intended shape, but that same weight can also feel stiff and unmoving against a fuller midsection, adding visual bulk rather than skimming past it. A very lightweight, thin knit moves easily and drapes softly, but it can also cling to whatever is underneath it, sometimes emphasizing exactly what you were hoping to soften instead of skimming past it gracefully. Somewhere between those two extremes sits a fabric with enough weight to hold a clean line and enough movement to skim rather than cling, and that particular middle ground tends to work well for a lot of women, though it genuinely does not work identically for every single body in every situation. Here is how to check this for yourself before you buy anything. Hold the cardigan up and let it hang freely from your hands, away from your body entirely, and notice how quickly or slowly the fabric settles into stillness. A fabric that swings and settles smoothly tends to move well on the body too. Put it on and walk a few steps, paying attention to whether the fabric moves with your body naturally or whether it stays rigid and stiff, almost fighting against your own movement as you walk. Reach your arms forward and to the side, the way you might reaching for something on a shelf, and notice whether the fabric restricts that movement or allows it comfortably without pulling or bunching anywhere uncomfortable. If you carry more fullness through your stomach, a mid-weight fabric with real movement often skims more comfortably than something stiff and structured, which can sometimes stand away from the body in a way that adds unwanted visual bulk rather than following your actual shape. If your fullness sits more through your hips, fabric weight may matter a little less here than the actual length and hem shape we already discussed earlier in this video. Weather and season genuinely matter too, of course, and a heavier knit that works beautifully in winter may simply feel like far too much fabric in warmer months, regardless of how well it otherwise fits your particular body and individual proportions. Even once you genuinely understand length, front opening, sitting behavior, and fabric movement, one more small decision still remains, and it is smaller than you might initially expect it to be. Whether to add a belt or tie to the cardigan at all. Number 2, the belt enclosure option. A belt or tie sounds like a small addition, almost an afterthought, and yet it can genuinely change how an entire cardigan reads on your body, for better or for worse depending on how it is actually used. Adding a belt or tie at the waist can create a defined point on your body, a place where the eye briefly pauses before continuing upward or downward, rather than letting the whole cardigan read as one continuous, undefined shape from shoulder to hem. This is not a claim that a belt automatically creates an hourglass silhouette for every woman who tries one, because that simply would not be true for every body. It is a tool, And like any tool, it works well in some situations and poorly in others. Here is where it can genuinely work against you instead. A belt pulled too tight can push fabric outward above and below it, creating exactly the kind of bulk you were hoping to avoid in the first place. A belt positioned at the wrong point on your torso, too high or too low relative to your actual waist, can throw off your proportions rather than balancing them the way you intended. Try this before deciding. Put the cardigan on and belt or tie it loosely first, just enough to hold it together without any real pulling or tension anywhere. Look at where that natural point falls on your own body specifically. Then try tightening it slightly and notice what changes both above the belt and below it, since both areas respond to that adjustment. Sit down while belted or tied in place and notice whether the belt digs in uncomfortably once you are fully seated, since this is very similar to the seated check we already covered for the cardigan itself earlier, and belts can create their own separate version of that same exact problem. If you carry more fullness through your stomach specifically, a belt positioned at your natural waist, wherever that actually falls on your own body, tends to work better than one forced to a generic, standard position that was not designed with your proportions in mind. If you carry more fullness through your hips instead, you may genuinely find that skipping the belt entirely and relying on the front opening effect we already discussed earlier works better for you personally than adding yet another defined line to the outfit. There is genuinely no single universal answer here, and that is completely fine, because the real goal of this entire video was never to hand you a strict rule book. It was to give you 6 different practical tools, each one genuinely useful in a different real-life situation, ready for you to actually use on your own terms, starting today. And now, the piece that finally genuinely connects every single one of them together into something you can actually use. Number 1, the torso length proportion match. Here is the realization that genuinely ties every single one of the 5 details we just covered into something you can actually use in real life, and it is genuinely the single most important idea in this entire video. 2 women can both honestly describe themselves as having a fuller midsection and still need 2 completely different cardigan lengths, because your own torso length is the piece that ultimately decides how every other detail actually plays out on your particular body. A cardigan length that lands beautifully and naturally on a longer torso can hit at a completely different, considerably less flattering point on a shorter one, even when both women happen to be wearing the exact same size in the exact same cardigan style. This is not about one torso being genuinely better than another in any real sense. It is simply about understanding your own individual proportions well enough to make length decisions that genuinely work for you, rather than for some imagined average body that may not resemble yours at all. Here is a simple, practical way to figure out roughly where you actually fall on that spectrum. Notice roughly how much distance genuinely sits between the bottom of your bust and the top of your hip. If that distance feels relatively short, a longer cardigan can end up overwhelming your entire frame, leaving very little visible torso showing beneath it at all. If that distance feels relatively long instead, a shorter cardigan can end up looking abrupt, cutting your body at a point that interrupts your natural line rather than working with it smoothly and comfortably. Once you have a rough sense of your own individual torso length, go back through everything we just covered together with that specific knowledge firmly in mind. If you have a shorter torso, favor lengths that land higher up. Pay closer attention to exactly how quickly a hem reaches your hip while sitting, and consider that a belt positioned at your own natural waist may actually sit closer to your bust than generic sizing charts typically assume it will. If you have a longer torso instead, you likely have considerably more flexibility to experiment with lower hem lengths, more dramatic open front effects, and belt placement without anything feeling crowded or cut short unexpectedly. None of this genuinely requires a measuring tape or complicated math done in your closet late at night. It requires simply standing in front of a mirror, honestly noticing where your own proportions actually sit, and then choosing the cardigan length that respects those proportions instead of fighting against them every single time you get dressed. This will not make every single cardigan you already own suddenly feel completely perfect, and no honest video could ever promise you something like that. What it will genuinely give you instead is something far more useful and lasting than perfection. It will give you a real, working, honest understanding of why some cardigans have always felt right on you and others simply never have, built entirely from your own real body and true proportions, not from a generic size chart or somebody else's measurements entirely, and not from guesswork either. Conclusion. So the next time you reach for your favorite cardigan and something about it just does not feel quite balanced, please remember everything we genuinely covered here together today. Your body was never the mistake, and it never truly was. A cardigan's length, its front opening, how it behaves once seated, its fabric weight, whether it's belted, and your own individual torso all work together. And honestly, any single one of them can be the actual reason something feels slightly off. You do not need 6 brand new cardigans to put this into practice starting today. You need to look at the ones already hanging in your closet with this new understanding and notice which details are actually working for you and which ones simply are not. I'd genuinely love to know, honestly, in the comments below, which of these 6 details surprised you the very most. The hip landing point, the open front, sitting behavior, fabric weight, belting, or your own individual torso length. And if this helped you today, consider subscribing for more.